My name's Robert Shaw. Basically been a bit of a geek for London history for most of my life. Well, about 15 years ago, I moved to Whitechapel and I became very, very interested in the work of Nicholas Hawksmoor, who was the only student of Christopher Wren. And really, once I'd understood a little bit more about Hawksmoor, I started to see behind him was Wren and the generation that lived and worked through what was called the Year of Miracles, 1665 to 1666. The poet laureate John Dryden wrote a poem called The Year of Miracles about this year. If you believed what you were told in church, this was a series of miracles. This was God enacting his justice on London for all the things that London had done. You know, in the sort of medieval Christian mindset, everything happened because God wanted it to happen. John Dryden described this as a year of miracles, a year of interventions by God. And London was only saved in this poem by the king sort of having a word with God on the city's behalf, and God then started being more merciful. But this year of miracles was obviously, if you were very religiously minded, an incredibly scary time. We had fire, famine, war, and disease. And lots of people did think it was God's doing. Now, if you were a banker or an insurance agent or someone with maybe a more of a calculating mindset, it became fairly clear that London was being incredibly, uniquely unlucky, to put it mildly, and that made lots of people suspicious. The version of events we get given now is not the understanding people had at the time. People at the time were very clear. You know, if they didn't believe in miracles, they needed another explanation, and one was readily available, and I'll show you what that is now. So this is called Year of Miracles, subtitle, Why James Stewart, who became King James II, was the most controversial man in England, in Britain. In order to give you proper context, I want to go back and just talk about James Stewart's dad, who famously had his head cut off. This is Charles I, who became king in 1625. And, you know, on the 30th of January, 1649, had his head cut off. The English Civil War was really down to him and the way he decided to try and be king in England, or in Britain. Now, the primary mover in his, let's say, power grab was his assertion of his divine right to rule. He said the king was above the law, God had put him there, and no one could question God. Therefore, no one could question him. He put himself as a king above the law, and he asserted that right from the get-go. Now, a few weeks into his reign, he married Henrietta Maria Bourbon, the sister of King Louis XIII in France. Now, that marriage was a surprise to an awful lot of people. Not a lot of people knew they'd never met, for example, and not a lot of people even knew that that marriage was on the cards. For people who looked to Holland and to the Protestant faith for their inspiration, this marriage was incredibly scary. It made the King of England part of the family of the King of France. Louis XIII and then his son Louis XIV were some of the most powerful absolute monarchs in Europe. And this marriage was very, very unpopular straight away. So unpopular that when Parliament met for the first time under Charles I, they did something unprecedented. Every king for hundreds of years had been granted for life the rights to collect tonnage and poundage. These are taxes on imports and exports and on wine. So every king prior to Charles I had been granted these rights for life. Parliament gave him the right to collect these taxes for only 1 year. They did that because they knew that if they'd granted him these taxes for life, he probably would have started his dictatorship then. His relationship with Parliament was obviously very, very bad, led to the Civil War. And really, after 1629, he had no more time for them, and he instituted what was called his personal rule. He just got rid of Parliament because they were getting in his way and asking him to do things he didn't want. So in order to raise taxes, he couldn't use Parliament, so he instituted what were called forced loans. These were really unpopular. He'd go round to someone's house with a list of, you know, what he said they owed him as king, like, you owe me £100,000 because because of this, 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 and this. And if the person said no, they said, well, all right, we'll just take it. So forced loans were a polite way of saying the king was going around stealing people's wealth at his discretion. And as you can imagine, for bankers, that's like hell on earth. It made him incredibly unpopular with anyone who looked to the rule of law and to look to property rights. They were all terrified of him because they never knew what was going to happen next. Now, his personal rule messed up. He managed to start a war with the Scots, and eventually he needed Parliament's help to get some money together so he could go and fight the Scots in essentially what was a religious dispute. In the process of which there was wranglings in Parliament, and 5 MPs alleged that his wife, Henrietta Maria Bourbon, was organising some French troops to come over to London to help the king enforce his will. That had been treason. She was accused of treason, and the king wasn't happy about it. So famously, these 5 MPs were in Parliament. Charles I rode to Parliament with about 300 armed men, bust into the House of Commons and said, I want to arrest these guys. Those 5 MPs had already escaped to the City of London. Now, at the time, it should be remembered, the City of London was a walled city. It had its old medieval wall. And very simply, when the king went to the City of London from Westminster to try and pick up these MPs, the City of London closed its gates on the king and said, no, you can't have them. That was completely unprecedented. No one had ever done that to the king before. And essentially, that was the start of the Civil War. A few weeks later, Charles left London, never to return as an effective king. Now, a point I want to make clear from the get-go is the importance of the Order of the Garter to Charles I and the Stewart family. They considered that to be the sort of apogee of their status, this international order of kings and other very high nobility across Europe were all members of the Order of the Garter. Now, not well-known fact is Charles I used the organisation of the Order of the Garter to essentially command his royalist army. The Order of the Garter was the kind of intelligence corps, the infrastructure corps that was used by the royalist side to organise their side in the English Civil War. The real reason I want to make, well, a fact I'm sure very, very few people listening to this will know, was actually the Order's secretary, the person who organised the Order of the Garter during the Civil War for Charles I was a guy called Christopher Wren. And that's not the famous architect Christopher Wren. This is Christopher Wren Sr., the architect's father. So I just want to make the point that Christopher Wren and his family were right at the heart of the Stewart court as early as the time of Charles I. So that's roughly like the headlines of the rule of Charles I, famously ending in his beheading. It was not a happy rule. So we'll move to his son now, Charles II. So he reigned between 1660 and 1685. Prior to that, during the English Civil War in 1646, he'd escaped to France and stayed with his cousin Louis and his mum. They stayed in France and moved around a bit in Europe, but were essentially exiles from England until he returned in 1660. The restoration of the monarchy happened pretty much exactly on his 30th birthday. And you can imagine for all the people who'd fought on the royalist side of the Civil War, this is incredibly good news because they were probably going to get their titles and privileges back. And for anyone who'd fought on Cromwell's side, they were fairly nervous because they had, after all, fought the royalists and killed the king. So there's a good deal of tension surrounding Charles II's restoration. He actually had quite a sizable armed guard surrounding him as he came into London because they weren't entirely sure what kind of reception he'd get. So we'll come back to the year of miracles, 65 to 66, but I want to put it in context for you. In 1667, after the fire, the City of London refused to extend the King's credit. Now, that never happened before. Part of the function of the City of London was to organise loans and organise finance for the King's government. And they said no that year. We'll talk about why that might be later on. In 1670, Charles II signed what's called the Secret Treaty of Dover with his cousin Louis XIV. This didn't become public knowledge until about 150 years later, but Charles and Louis agreed several things in this treaty. One was that they'd both attack the Dutch in a joint effort to destroy the Dutch Netherlands as a political entity. Another thing is they agreed a sort of secret relaxation of trade barriers to French goods. So French goods would start being allowed into Britain. And thirdly, and most damningly, I think Charles II accepted an annual payment from Louis XIV. He was going to get, he made himself the King of England, or the King of Britain, became an employee of the King of France. And obviously he didn't want people to know he'd agreed that, so he didn't tell anyone. It was his sister, who was married to Louis XIV's brother, who did a lot of the organisation of this treaty. Secret Treaty of Dover, look it up. You don't get taught it in school because it makes him look like what he was, which was a traitor. He was much more loyal to his family in France than he was to his country in Britain, if you like. Another example of his lack of care, let's say, was in 1672. This is called the Great Stop. He basically used a war that he and his brother had started illegally against the Dutch as an excuse to stop paying any of his debts. He said he'd pay interest on his debts, but not the principal. Now that, as you can imagine, the king was in a lot of debt, had a lot of creditors, and that bankrupted, some people say, about 10,000 noble families. He was fairly careful to only bankrupt families who hadn't been supportive of him and his family during the Civil War. The Great Stop caused incredible financial ruin, and this is only, a few years after, and as London was trying to rebuild itself physically, he really, really savagely damaged it financially. Again, not well known, but in January 1679, he just disbanded Parliament, just told them, I don't need you anymore, goodbye. This is in part because he now had increased revenue due to his treaty with Louis, his cousin Louis. He also cut down the size of his royal court. He sort of tightened his belt, and this meant he was completely then free of Parliament, any obligations to Parliament. He didn't need them. He didn't need their money. And as a result of this, apparently his friends and the royal court just descended into kind of a hedonistic kind of revelry. They were absolutely like pigs in shit, and no one could tell them what to do anymore. So they partied like it was 1679. They really, really had a good time. And lots of people pointed out quite how, they'd squander huge amounts of money on silly little things, but no one could stop them now. There were no checks and balances. So in 1683, he famously asked, quo warranto, like, where does the City of London get its privileges from? And because he was trying to squeeze the City of London for money, and they really didn't like that, he ended up removing the City of London's privileges in 1683. So towards the end of the reign, there was no Parliament and no City of London. He destroyed the two institutions you could say were most responsible for the death of his father. And a very nice reflection on who he is, because he said he was a Protestant, he reigned as a Protestant monarch, he said he was Protestant to his core and all of this sort of thing, but actually on his deathbed, he converted back to Catholicism. And I think that shows you kind of like something about his psychology, because he was quite willing to lie for his entire life, but was very keen to convert before he died. So I think it's fair to say he would have, in his heart of hearts, considered himself a Catholic, but he was a Protestant for public relations purposes. There's an interesting thing he said. The king's barber, he always insisted his barber, the guy who used one of those cutthroat razors on him, was a Catholic. He said he'd never let a Protestant hold a cutthroat knife to his neck. It's pretty clear he had very, very strong pro-French, pro-Catholic sympathies, and there's been a lot of attempts to, revisionism and trying to make him look like less of a traitor, but that's essentially what he was. If you believed in the Protestant faith, he was not. You were not in agreement with him. We could talk about psychological reasons for that. Both of him and his brother James, who we'll talk about in a second, sort of saw Catholicism as the way things had always been. It sort of represented stability and continuity for them, and the Protestants sort of represented the disruption that had been the Civil War and ended up with their father having his head cut off. As you can imagine, their mother was never very happy that her royal husband, the king, had his head cut off, and she was very, very clear about who she blamed: the Protestants, the bankers, and the City of London. So let's move from Charles to his younger brother, because Charles died without any legitimate children. So his younger brother, James, became king. He was only king for 3 years, and you'll see why. But he was a very talented man, because at the age of 3, he was already Lord High Admiral. He was clearly a bit of a genius, because people had recognized at the age of 3, he's definitely a guy you want to have in charge of the Navy, you know? So he had a long, let's say, emotional and probably ego sort of attachment to the Navy. He thought the Navy was his, he was the Navy. One thing he did straight away while his brother was, you know, getting his crown fitted and being, you know, made king in 1660, one of the first things James II did was institute the Royal Africa Company, which had a monopoly on the slave trade. So on that transatlantic slave trade, James II was the principal shareholder in the company that had a monopoly, and he made a fortune out of slavery. He also enslaved, during his reign, people who weren't from Africa. He enslaved people who rebelled against him and sent them to the Caribbean as well. He was pretty clear slavery was a great thing because you could make loads of money at it. Real quick, in 1664, we're going to come back to this. He started a war with the Dutch for no good reason, or it was an unprovoked war, let's put it that way. In 1669, this is when he publicly acknowledged his Catholicism. It's likely he converted much, much earlier than that. But in 1669, it became public knowledge in Britain that the heir to the throne was Catholic. And this made a lot of people nervous, principally because it indicated he would probably have closer relations with France and, you know, was leaning in the direction totally 180 degrees from the direction of the city of London, and the economy was leaning, which was much more towards the Dutch and Protestantism. So in the 1670s, he became the most controversial figure in England. He liking or disliking James II really became one of the defining features of the political parties that became known as the Whigs and the Tories. He was incredibly controversial, and I hope to show you why. Trust me, anyone who was around in the 1670s, it was one of those things, a bit like Brexit. Everyone had an opinion. He was either great or he was, you know, he was either the Christ incarnate or the devil incarnate, you know, depending on what side of the argument we were on. So again, there was that a second war with the Dutch. It was totally unprovoked. I'll skip on. And in 1685, he was crowned James II. Within a few months, he had a standing army just sitting around, not being formed to fight any particular battle, but a standing army of 20,000 men with many, 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 many Catholic officers. They were stationed for a long time, a few miles from me in Hounslow Heath, which is a day's march from the city of London. So all of a sudden, without precedent in British history, there was a standing army of 20,000 men with Catholic officers a day's march from the city of London. That made the bankers very, very nervous. And essentially, they organized a revolution. They organized a coup in 1688. James II was chased out of London, basically, and went and lived with his cousin Louis in France for the rest of his life. It's not well known that the last time this country was successfully invaded was in 1688. And that was because James II had set himself up as a sort of absolute monarch with his army, with his Catholicism, and with his complete disregard for the traditions that had, you know, that he'd inherited. I just thought it's worth showing you this because really the difference between Whigs and Tories kind of formed in the Civil War. If you were a Whig, you were likely to have formed on the parliamentary side. If you were a Tory, you would have fought on the Crown side. These divisions sort of crystallized into what became known as political parties. And I'm going to show you one of the first times the word Tories was ever used in print in a bit. The Whigs wanted James Stewart deposed. They saw him as a potential despot. They wanted to secure their property rights. They wanted an empire roughly modelled on what the Dutch were doing, which was roughly modelled on what the Venetians had done. And the Whigs were very much looking to Holland for financial and religious cooperation. On the other hand, you got the Tories. They fought on the Crown side. They wanted James to succeed. He had divine right. They believed in the absolute power and the divine right of the king. The king shouldn't be questioned, just like God shouldn't be questioned, you know. They wanted more like an agrarian aristocracy, like it had always been, you know, serfs living on the land, paying over their crops to the lord of the manor, who pays over his crops to the duke or whatever the higher up is, and a very hierarchical system. They had very close religious and financial ties to France. So between the you could say the Civil War, but certainly in the 1670s, these terms, Whigs and Tories, were used. Until 1834, they hated each other. They kind of fought it out for control of the country. And in 1834, they got together and formed that institution we all know and love, today's modern Conservative Party. Gotta love them. The Whigs and the Tories hated each other, but they buried their hatchet because they realised some people were suggesting poor people should have the vote. There was the liberal movement, there was the Chartist movement, let's make life a little bit fairer. And however much they hated each other, and you know, they had members of each other's families had been killed in the Civil War, and people remembered this over the generations. They buried all their hatchets in order to prevent poor people and maybe even women getting the vote. I mean, that was enough for them to forget everything else that had ever happened, because poor people might get the vote and that'd be the end of civilization as they knew it. So they wanted to stop the Chartists. They wanted to keep the House of Lords. They ended up turning India into part of the empire. But they had this sort of 200 years of animosity to get over. And they buried some huge hatchets. And I'm going to show you that this Year of Miracles was one of these things that they fought over for over 100 years. And our history was unequivocally rewritten to bury this story. Unequivocally, certain histories written by people at the time have been edited to remove information that they previously had. The most obvious example I could tell you is check out the work of a guy called Gilbert Bernay, who was the Bishop of Salisbury, and his work said stuff when he wrote it in the sort of 1720s. He wrote stuff down that you will not now find in versions of his history printed today because it's been edited out. Literally, our history has been redacted to cover up what happened during the Year of Miracles. So here we go. And this is sort of my take on that year. Just to be clear again, it was an eventful 12, 18 months. There was a war with the Dutch, unprecedented plague and completely unprecedented fire. It's worth mentioning people who were very, very, I'm going to say Tory members of the clergy, kept telling people this was all their fault. This was God's punishment for London, on London, for what London had done. Specifically, London had organised the execution of Charles I, and therefore they shouldn't be surprised that God would seek to take his revenge on those people who had killed his representative on earth. This is literally what priests were saying to illiterate people who no doubt were scared witless by everything that they were experiencing. The actual physical war, the physical plague, and the physical fire were compounded by a psychological barrage. It's really quite amazing to see these, you know, sherry drinking men in dresses talking nonsense about 2,000-year-old bullshit, really, really, really hammering it home to people, saying this, the fact your dad has just died of plague is because you deserve it. And it really, really was like, I'm going to say victim blaming is a polite way of putting it. I'm really trying not to swear. The first war, the Anglo-Dutch Wall, the war that was happening at the time, started on June the 24th, 1664. The Royal Navy simultaneously attacked Dutch shipping in Africa, America, and Asia. There must have been some kind of plan, you know, open these orders on June 24th or whatever. People opened these orders and they were instructed, every ship of the line was instructed to attack Dutch shipping. Now, specifically, the most valuable commodity the Dutch were trading was nutmeg. And the Royal Navy specifically targeted nutmeg supplies from the Dutch. Now, nutmeg was the most valuable commodity in the world. That's kind of a well-known fact. The Dutch had a monopoly for a while, but the trade had started in the 1300s and the Venetians had a monopoly on it then. You might well know that Samuel Peeps of the Diary fame worked for the Royal Navy. His job title at the time was Surveyor of Victuals. That's the guy who sort of looks over the logistics and victuals being food stuff and stuff like that. I'm going to say in this context, Surveyor of Victuals is a kind of a polite title or posh title for someone who counts the booty, who sort of sees what you've got and how much it's all worth. because there was an awful lot of booty. They did pirate and rob a lot of Dutch shipping, and the Dutch were completely caught off guard by this. So initially it was very, very successful. I want to show you this from Samuel Pepys's diary, because Samuel Pepys was incredibly close to the Stewarts and to James Stewart in particular, who I'll remind you was the most controversial man in England. And so Samuel Pepys, looking back at the year of the plague on December the 31st, 1665, said this: "Thus ends this year to my great joy in this manner. I have raised my estate from £1,300 in this year to £4,400. I've got myself greater interest, I think, by my diligence and being surveyor of victuals." In other words, he'd gone from being worth about £1.3 million in today's money to being worth about 4.4 million. I mean, that's very rough translation. He became incredibly rich, as did a load of other people that year who were part of this Tory circle around James II. They made a fortune. Now, why is that relevant? This is a modern report. You can, the link's at the bottom there if you want to read the whole thing. But I highlighted this section, and I'm sure you'll work out why. The most effective extract against insects was nutmeg, which showed 100% repellency against all these insects after 4 hours of exposure. I.e., if you eat some nutmeg, after a couple of hours, no insect is going to bite you. And that's been tested in the modern era and was well known at the time. A lady called Hildegard von Bingen, who was a German abbess, had actually done experiments with nutmeg hundreds of years before and sat in a flea-infested, fly-infested stables, having eaten some nutmeg, and left after several hours without a single bite on her, whereas everyone else who'd been in the room with her was bitten. Nutmeg repelled insects, and that was very well understood. The reason why it was so expensive was because people had worked out if you didn't get bitten by insects, you didn't get the plague. Nutmeg, taken daily, was the rich man's way of immunizing himself, you could say, or just protecting themselves against plague. And for hundreds of years, this trade had gone on kind of quietly amongst the aristocracy. Get me some nutmeg, I don't want to get plague. The other thing being, don't tell everyone that this is what nutmeg does, otherwise everyone's going to want it and the price is going to hit the roof. So you won't have heard that before. Well, I doubt you've heard that before, but nutmeg stops you getting plague, which is why it's the most valuable commodity in the world. And lo and behold, James II had got his hands on tons of the stuff just in time. The Anglo-Dutch Wall was started by James Stewart. It drove a wedge between the two major Protestant powers in Europe. It helped Louis XIV, because while we were fighting, the British were fighting the Dutch on the sea, Louis XIV took the opportunity to attack them on land. It's kind of like a pincer movement, if you like. James and his friends made a fortune in booty. It wasn't just nutmeg, but mainly nutmeg is what we're talking about. The nutmeg was incredibly valuable because of its medical properties. And actually, just to finish this war off, this war ended in humiliation for James. In 1667, we had to make terms with the Dutch after the Dutch had actually sailed up the Thames estuary into the Medway and stolen or destroyed half the British Navy. He started a war illegally and for no good reason. He ended it with his tail between his legs. And that's a fair summary of everything that James II did. He was not he was not overburdened with success. This is the plague. And again, the little link is there at the bottom. Other sources of information are available. Now, very briefly, very roughly, the plague started in Central Asia, would spread out through Europe, through the Middle East, come up Italy, through Paris, through France, and hit London. That's roughly what would happen in other outbreaks of plague. Now, real quick, the mechanism apparently is that there'd be a boom in the rat population. Loads of fleas would live on the rats, and then the rats would die off, and the fleas were like, oh, we've got nowhere to live anymore. There'd be a booming bust in the rat population. That would force fleas to jump onto anything that they could find, including humans. They've worked out roughly about 10 or 15 years after a boom and bust in the rat population in Central Asia, you can predictably, you find that there are significant outbreaks of plague in Europe and elsewhere. The mechanism of transmission is really pretty well understood now. Epidemiologists have really looked into the plague. They've had hundreds of years to do so. And this is very much the agreed upon mechanism for how plague spread. But not in 1665, because the plague that hit 1665 hit London, but not Paris, didn't hit Italy or the Middle East. So this I'm going to say the usual way that plague was transmitted historically did not occur in 1665, and that's not my conclusion. That's epidemiologists. So this chart shows different peaks of the plague, the Black Death, over the years. It starts on the left. The really tall one was the first peak in what was 1348. I think it hit London, or roughly about then. That's a huge peak, and you can see different peaks happen. The second biggest peak is the Italian plague. That happened in about 1630 or 1629. And again, that was well understood, or is now understood, in terms of that chain of transmission that I showed you a moment ago. But you'll see the next largest peak after the Italian plague that's labelled is the Great Plague of London, 1665 to 66. That cannot be explained by what I'd call the natural train of events. Notably not the London plague of 1665, the plague in Marseille, which actually happened in 1720, does follow this chain event. Every instance of Black Death, major instance of Black Death that they've looked into, that can be explained in this way, except the one in London in 1665. And I'd say if that's obvious to people now, looking back, it would have been equally obvious to people back then, especially doctors and so on. How is it the plagues hit London, but Paris is all right? That's not what normally happens. Certainly people would have noticed that. And people did notice that, because it was very, very, it was unprecedented, put it like that. No one could understand how this had happened. Although some people had their suspicions, because in 1665, this guy, Robert Hooke, published his book Micrographia, which is a series of incredible diagrams and illustrations he did looking at things under the microscope. Perhaps most famously, this illustration of the flea that became public knowledge in 1665. Robert Hooke was undoubtedly the world's greatest expert on fleas during a time when fleas were causing an unprecedented plague. I don't want to elaborate too much on that. I'll just leave it for your consideration at the moment. But needless to say, Robert Hooke, as I'll show you in a moment, was very much a Tory. The plague outbreak in 1665 was unique, very localized, very quick. Somehow, some people had got their hands on loads of nutmeg just in time. Rather unnecessarily, the gates of the city of London were shut. The mechanics of that were a bit convoluted, but people were shut into the city of London, the gated walls, and unless you could pay a doctor to give you a clean bill of health, which would have cost you a lot of money, you were stuck in there. So it was kind of like being kettled in an area full of plague, and about 100,000 people died inside the walls and out. Now, as discussed, fleas had been subject to the study by Robert Hooke, and I should say at this point it was fairly clear to several doctors whose records you can read that fleas and insect bites were part of the mechanism of plague. This was pretty well understood. So for Robert Hooke to have drawn a very, very detailed picture of a flea and have it published that year when the plague hit would have certainly, I think, struck anyone who was educated in the medical profession as an incredibly strange coincidence. Because again, not everyone in the medical profession, but the doctors of the very rich and the aristocracy were, for hundreds of years, prescribing nutmeg to their clients. They knew what it did. They knew how it worked. So for Robert to publish that was certainly attention grabbing. Well known to everyone in London at the time, Robert Hooke's best friend and slightly sort of bigger boy, if you like, slightly superior to him in status, but his best buddy was this guy who you've heard of, Christopher Wren Jr. Might not be well known, but because his father was helping run the Order of the Garter in the 1630s, the Wren family all lived in Windsor Castle, or in the grounds of Windsor Castle. There was a friend, they had friendly relations with the two Stewart brothers. They were part of a very small circle. Now, in 1660, when Charles II came back, it was Christopher Wren who actually gave Charles II all the paperwork and all the ritual books and records of the Order of the Garter. His dad and Christopher Wren's dad had taken all those records and must have buried them or hidden them somewhere, because certainly they were looked for, and no one could find them. So Wren was went into Westminster and saw Charles II for the first time as king, was able to give him the records that of the Order of the Garter that went back to the 14th century. So this was seen as a great boost to this notion of continuity and the fact that this is the way things have always been. You know, this is the ancient regime. Wren returning the papers of the Order of the Garter was a big part of Charles II getting business as usual back together, you could say. Not well known, but very interestingly, in 1665, Wren visited Paris, which was being rebuilt for Louis XIV by a guy called Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was a bit of an architect and a sort of a logistics expert. How do you rebuild a whole town? That's a big job. Lots and lots of different aspects to it. How do you organize them all? Jean-Baptiste Colbert was an acknowledged expert in this, was doing this in Paris for Louis XIV. And as it turned out, it was very, very lucky bit of training, because lo and behold, Chris Wren avoided the plague in 1665 because he was in Paris. He came back in 1666 and the whole town burnt down. And very quickly, he had incredibly detailed plans drawn up for rebuilding the city from scratch. I should say these plans, the fire was kind of acknowledged to go out, stopped growing on the 6th of September, but there were still fires going on all over the place in basements. You know, things were still smoking and burning and very hot. But according to Christopher Wren and his son and our official history, in those few days, whilst London was still smouldering, he and Robert Hooke ran around and surveyed the entire place. They did a survey, they mapped it all out, and by the 11th of September, 1666, I'm going to say 5 days to be generous, after the fire pretty much stopped, Wren had drawn up an amazingly detailed plan for how to rebuild London. I'll show you the plan in a second, but it's an incredibly quick bit of work. And given that he, had spent the previous year learning how to redesign towns, you've got to really wonder, how lucky does one man get? I'd say, at what point does this? Well, for me, I know roughly when these facts would drip into me as I read around, and you can imagine being alive at the time, knowing full well Christopher Wren, his loyalties, his political opinions, and lo and behold, he's gone off to France, learn how to rebuild a city, and all of a sudden the city's ready to be rebuilt. People were suspicious, and for good reason. On this is another detail. On the 18th of September in the morning, Charles II issued a proclamation saying there should be no rebuilding work done in London until the roads are redrawn and we've sort of reorganised things. We're going to take this opportunity to reorganise and make London more wonderful. You can imagine that made Christopher Wren very, very happy. He literally thought on that morning his plan, I'll show you in a second, was he'd won eternity. London would be rebuilt as he designed it, and he'd essentially won. I'm going to say he'd won eternity. I don't know quite how to put it. He had everything he wanted in the morning of September the 18th. Now, sometimes in the afternoon, the visitors from the Guildhall from the City of London came to Charles II and said, look, if you say we're not allowed to rebuild our buildings on our plots of land, and all of a sudden you're going to implement this incredibly detailed plan after this freakish accident has just happened, we don't believe that's an accident. You're a tyrant and we will rebel against you. I'm not sure who wrote the minutes of this meeting because they're very hard to find, but it's pretty clear that something very drastic happened, because by the afternoon of September the 18th, Charles II made another proclamation saying exactly the opposite of the proclamation made in the morning. He was now saying, no, just rebuild as you were. We're not going to try and impose a new street plan. We're not going to do any of that. Sorry for any confusion. So between the morning and the afternoon of September the 18th, 1666, Christopher Wren went from king of the world to very, very, very unhappy. I actually fished it out. I'll give you this. This is something that Christopher Wren wrote to Charles II. And this is what he wrote as a public, as an open, anyone could read this or get access to this. So God only knows what he said to him in private, because what he said was about Charles's unwillingness to impose this new street plan. Wren wrote, nothing will more discover abroad the weakness of our government, both as to the discretion of our governors and their influence upon the commonalty, than this, that having an opportunity in their hands of doing one of the greatest benefits that can be done to the public, they were unable to bring it to pass or unwilling to be at the trouble. Now, I'll just break that down for you. Nothing will discover abroad the weakness of our government. You're advertising to yourself and to the whole world what a weak man you are. The weakness of your discretion, i.e. the weakness of your mind, and your inability, your influence over the commonality. You're advertising to all the world that you're a weak-minded man who can't control his population. And having such a great opportunity to do something so beneficial, you were too lazy to be bothered. That's a polite, that's a sort of 17th century cuss. And he put all this stuff in writing, and he was very clear about it for the rest of his life. Christopher Wren was angry with Charles II for the rest of Charles II's life. Christopher Wren was actually one of James II's biggest supporters when he became king, but we'll get to that in a minute. So this is Wren's plan, or part of it. You can see it's very, very intricate, and there are a lot of notes and so on that went with it. It wasn't just the design, there was all kinds of paperwork that went with it. But I want to show you these two friends, Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke. Hooke became the surveyor of the City of London just a few months before Wren became the King's surveyor. So these best friends were in the two best positions to be in to help rebuild London after the fire. Hooke was the professor of geometry at what's called Gresham College. Now, Gresham College was one of the few big buildings in the City of London that didn't burn down. It was miraculously saved. Now, everyone else in Gresham College, all the other professors had to move out because the City of London used the building as offices, because their offices had been burnt down. Robert Hooke was allowed to stay and was made city surveyor. He was pretty much one of the only people in London who didn't have to move house as a result of the Great Fire of London. He actually looked out on the morning of I think it's the 5th of September, and he said he could see fire all around him, but somehow miraculously his home, Gresham College, was not touched. You can speculate about why that might be. But these guys reckon Wren and Hooke were best friends. They'd known each other since Oxford, and they'd both sort of had shared traumas during the Civil War. Hooke's father had actually committed suicide because he was acting illegally for Charles II. It's a bit of a convoluted story, but essentially Hooke's father was acting as an agent, maybe for Charles I, while Charles I was kind of arrested on the Isle of Wight. And in order to prevent Hooke's father's property being confiscated, he took the decision, because he was going to get arrested and he was going to get prosecuted for being a spy for Charles I, and he'd have lost all his property and all his rights. So rather than that happen, he committed suicide. He kept his property and his family were able to inherit. So you can imagine Hooke was very upset by his father's suicide. He was packed off to London a couple of weeks later with £40 and a box full of books, and he never really got over the fact that, a few weeks before his dad had been chatting to the king. Now his dad was dead, and he was sent off to London and educated by a very royalist sympathising school in Westminster. Wren's family was so intimately tied up with the Stuarts that they were utterly ruined during the Civil War. Wren's father wasn't arrested, but he was watched. He died in poverty. Wren's uncle was the Bishop of Ely, Nicholas Wren, and he was put in prison in the Tower of London. The Wren family were well known to be right at the heart of the Stuart court. So both Hooke and Wren had lost out massively during the Civil War, and were both massively happy, let's say, when Charles II was restored, because they and other people like them, royalists, had left London and gone to Oxford just to be out of the way while Cromwell and the Commonwealth was in effect. And really, they only moved back to London once Charles II moved back to London. They were part of a small circle of ultra-loyal scientists, politicians, soldiers, and so on. We'll talk about that in a little bit more. But what's remarkable about this picture of Robert Hooke on the left is actually, until fairly recently, last 20, 30 years, no one thought there was a portrait of Robert Hooke left. And that's because Isaac Newton of gravity fame, when he became president of the Royal Society, he had all of Robert Hooke's portraits burnt. And he did that to deliberately, I mean, your portrait was a big thing. You were a gentleman, you got your portrait done. It was a way of immortalizing you. You know, your portrait would be up in the Royal Society and everyone could look at you, remember you'd work. Newton, who was a very, very strong Whig, had all of Hooke's portraits burnt and tried to erase him from history. Really, it's only in the last 20, 30 years that people have started talking about Hooke again and his lost legacy. When you look at what he did, or what he's likely to have done, it seems to me completely obvious that he was, if you like, a Tory scientist doing Tory things, and the Whigs wanted him removed from history. Again, just to emphasize this Whig-Tory dynamic within the scientific community as it was everywhere else, Wren's cousin, Nicholas, was secretary to James Stewart, who eventually became James II. When James II became king, Wren was a loyal supporter. These guys, Hooke, Wren, they were about as dyed-in-the-wool Tory, Stewart-supporting people as you could ever possibly meet. Lots of people considered it a strange coincidence that these two best friends, who are known to hate the city of London, ended up being in these incredibly fortuitous roles, Hooke as city surveyor, Wren as the king surveyor, just in time for all this to happen. Awful lot of ducks seem to have spontaneously got into a line in order for this to happen. Now, I mentioned this guy earlier. After the Glorious Revolution, after James II was kicked off the throne and fled to France, there were an awful lot of roles that needed to be filled. A lot of Stewart loyalists had scarpered the country. This guy, Gilbert Bernay, on Easter Day 1689 was made Bishop of Salisbury, and then 3 days later was made Chancellor of the Order of the Garter. So you can see he was a Whig. He was very, very obviously a very trusted man, because once William of Orange and the Whigs got into power, they put him into two very senior positions in the sort of aristocratic hierarchy. Bishop of Salisbury, an important job if you believe in all of that sort of thing. Certainly a very well paid position. And I'm not so clear about the Chancellor of the Order of the Garter. That would have been a kind of a more formal role, maybe not as hands-on as being secretary like Wren's dad was. But he was very quickly, after the Glorious Revolution, put into positions of considerable trust and responsibility. Gilbert Bernay, Bishop of Salisbury, Scottish Whig, and essentially a spy. His book, Gilbert Bernay's book, History of My Own Time, one of the things that you'll find very difficult to find anywhere else. And I'm just going to have to, I want to read this out. Bernay records that Captain John Graunt, who's a figure we'll talk about a bit more in a moment, went to the New River Company Reservoir in Islington on the night of the Saturday, the 2nd of September, 1666. So there was a reservoir that since about 1570 had been built in Islington, and that stored pressurized water. Rivers had been diverted. They'd put it in this reservoir, and that water was what was put under pressure through the pipeworks of the City of London. Now, the night before the fire, John Graunt went to the reservoir, turned off the water, locked the doors, and walked away with the key. Now, no one had ever turned the water off. No one had ever locked the doors before, and certainly no one had locked the doors and walked away with the key. For the first few hours of when the actual Great Fire of London hit, London had no piped water, and people were like genuinely freaked out by this. The routine was apparently, if there was a fire, you'd identify where the pipework was, you'd smash it, and you'd use the water that spilt out to fight the fire. People noticed very quickly that that was not available. And actually later, a couple of days later, people went to the reservoir, smashed open the doors, broke open the locks and turned the water back on. And an attendant there identified Graunt as the man who'd done this. Graunt never denied it, and he said he'd forgot that he'd taken the keys. He was very much protected by his friendship with the Royal Circle. Down on the river, just away from Pudding Lane, Fish Street, there were 5 water wheels, which are the alternative way that London got piped pressurised water. These water wheels would turn, they were piped over the roof of a church, and that gravity gave them a bit of pressure. Coincidentally, all 5 water wheels also broke that night, along with John Graunt turning off the water. So in a way that I think you'd find is statistically significant, suddenly all of these accidents happened on the same night. Clearly, John Graunt turning off the water was no accident. John Graunt, and here's the killer, was well-known associate of Hook and Wren, and that circle. They were friends, and if you lived in London and you hung around in those sort of circles, either Whig or Tory, you'd have known this. There's the Bishop of Salisbury saying one of the King's supporters turned off the water for the Fire of London. And I'll say again, you look at Gilbert Bernay's History of My Time Now, and all of this stuff is edited out. Unsurprisingly, other stuff is edited out. In fact, his book, if you want to read it, pretty much single-handedly rewrites a lot of the history that we get taught, because he shows you things that happened that have been edited out of our history, because they, why should plebs like us actually know what the royals, what these people in power really did? I highly recommend anyone who's interested in this check out History of My Own Time by Gilbert Bernay. It's available online in the versions before 1820 are much more interesting than the versions printed after 1820, and we'll get to that. It wasn't just the Bishop of Salisbury who was saying, this is more than a little bit suspicious. Not many people know that Parliament investigated the causes of the Fire of London and printed a report in 1667 about what they found. Now, the actual printing of the report was fairly controversial, and I'll explain why. So there were roughly 70 MPs. The majority of them, if you go through the list, which I have done, were Tories, did tend to be sympathetic to the King. But these 70 MPs were quite happy after receiving evidence to sign off on a report that said the King's Guard. Now, that's the King Charles II's personal protection force. I could go through some of the personalities who were in that personal protection force, were going round rescuing arsonists who'd been caught. The City of London constables, the police, were going around and caught a few people, like with fire bombs on them, starting fires. They were then rescued. These arsonists were rescued by the King's Guard. In this report, the chairman of the report, a guy called Sir Robert Brooke, says we've got several people who were caught under strong suspicion during the time of the fire, who were caught committing arson, who were then taken by the King's Guard, but nothing ever was heard of them again. What that implies is these 70 MPs are saying someone to do with your court, Your Majesty, has got these arsonists. And that really would count as being seditious, i.e. trying to bring the King's government into disrepute. Any accusations of sedition were punishable by death, indeed by hang, drawing and quartering. So you've got these 70 MPs making an accusation about the King's friends that could have had them hung, drawn and quartered if the King had decided to prosecute them for sedition. And again, as well as the King's Guard, this report written by these MPs identifies John Kelling, who was the Lord Chief Justice, of intimidating juries. And it says it very explicitly. Again, that would be sedition, calling the Lord Chief Justice into, questioning his judgment. Seditious, could get you hung, drawn and quartered. And twice the report identifies James Stewart, the Duke of York, the most controversial man in the country, as assisting arsonists who had been taken by a city constable. So you've got all these instances of people very, very close to the King being named in a parliamentary report. By putting your name to this, if you're an MP, you were putting your name to something that was accusing the King and his court of nefarious action, whatever you want to call it, and you could be hung, drawn and quartered. I don't know many MPs any politicians over time who were really that brave or that principled. I think they knew what they were signing. So they didn't get prosecuted. In fact, the King just dissolved the King dissolved the committee over the summer. And when they tried to re-meet, they were told, no, you can't. And they're in kind of protest at this, members of the committee got all their notes together and published it. And this is what it's looking at now is the front page of this report that they published. Unbelievably, the King just said this report is kind of illegal. He didn't call it seditious, but I want every copy of it to be confiscated and burnt. And indeed, the public hangman went around London trying to find copies of this report. If you had it, you could be I think, certainly fined, and your copy of the report was burnt. Also, later, any trace of this report was removed from the public record. So as far as I know, this is the only parliamentary report that was burnt by the government. And, you know, the fact that you burnt the report into the fire of London is, you know, pretty remarkable. So even though this report was burnt and the king tried to bury it, you can imagine the Whigs never forgot all these things. They'd seen the king's brother, the king's personal bodyguard, and the king's kind of chief judge nobbling people and trying to stop people from speaking their truth, which is they'd seen. And you can read this report. There's a link I can send anyone who's interested. The copy of this report. There were dozens of times credible people saw people with fire bombs and other incendiary devices starting fires. Some in Southwark, and this gets written out of our history as well. We're told the fire was all an accident. It was all on the north side of the river. Well, in this report, it's very clear Southwark was burned, and that couldn't have happened by accident. And actually, a man was caught starting fires in Southwark. He was handed over to the King's Guard and disappeared. So you can imagine people being told, oh, it was all an accident, and it all started in Pudding Lane. The bloke whose pub was burnt down in Southwark wasn't convinced by that, and he told Parliament. On the 18th of September, something very interesting happened. Christopher Wren was absolutely livid, you know. Must be a scary thing to see a 5'4" architect in a bad mood. And as I said, the report was actually published after the committee was disbanded in 1667, and the king tried to have it destroyed. There aren't many public, parliamentary reports that people get excited about, and let alone ones that are so famous that they get reprinted 12 years later. But that's actually what happened. In 1679, Charles had dissolved Parliament, and he and his friends decided now was a good time to republish the parliamentary report into the fire, but they give it a bit of editing. And actually, the version of the report published in 1679 doesn't mention the King's Guard, doesn't mention the Duke of York, doesn't mention any of the important bits that were in the original report. They published a redacted version of the original report. And why would you do that 12, 13 years later if there was no controversy surrounding it? Why would you bother to rewrite a parliamentary report that you previously had confiscated and burnt? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. But in kind of response to being dissolved, people met in Westminster anyway. And on the 10th of January 1680, this statement was proclaimed. And again, you won't see this in any modern history book. This is the House of Commons. Although it had been disbanded, like I say, the previous year in Oxford, they got together and were like, well, we can't just lay down for this. If we don't do something, we're not going to have all of our freedoms, all of our rights, all of our privileges will be gone. So on the 10th of January 1680, look this up. Houses of Parliament said that it is the opinion of this House that the City of London was burnt in the year 1666 by the Papists, designing thereby to introduce arbitrary power and popery into this kingdom. So that's quite a bold statement for the House of Commons. Again, they're not directly accusing anyone, but no one disagreed with them either, without directly saying anything. Anyone around at the time knew exactly what was meant by this. And I promised you earlier I'd show you one of the first ever instances of the word Tories in print. And when I came across this, I just couldn't help myself but share. So this is the title of a speech that was given in the City of London. And it was called The Address of Above 20,000 Loyal Protestant Apprentices of London, humbly presented to the Right Honourable Lord Mayor, who at the time was a guy called Sir Patience Ward, on September the 2nd, 1681, the day appointed by Act of Parliament to be yearly observed in the commemoration of the burning of that famous Protestant city by Papists, Jesuits and Tories, anno 1666. Parliament had decreed every year we're going to commemorate the fact that our city of London was burnt down by Papists, Jesuits and Tories. And actually Tories there, that at the bottom of that statement is one of the first times you'll see that word in print. So the Whigs were very clear. It was the Tories what done it. And they kept saying it and kept saying it. And it wasn't just the bloke down the pub. it was the Bishop of Salisbury, it was the Lord Mayor of London, and it was including a guy called John Tillotson, who after 1688 in the Glorious Revolution became Archbishop of Canterbury. So people who said that it was the Tories who set fire to London included the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was the King William III's closest advisor. So you have the King, Archbishop of Canterbury, Bishop of Salisbury, Houses of Commons, Lord Mayor of London. There's a longer list than that, but a lot of people were very clear. These were the people that were there at the time, mind you, not your primary school teacher who's just read stuff out of a book printed in the last 30 years. So last bit of the aftermath of the fire, in 1689, when the Glorious Revolution had happened, the report again was republished in full, and the King's Guard is back in it, the Lord Chief Justice Kelling is back in it, and Stewart, James II, as I've labelled in there, was back in the report. This was done to make clear to people, look, we couldn't have carried on having this bunch of people running the country because they burnt the, they burnt the city, they burnt London down. They were mad. They republished it. What's that now? 22 years later? How many 23 years later, how many parliamentary reports get republished like that? It was an incredible document. The way I found it, I'll just tell you this, because it took a while. Someone took a copy to America. They flew off to America to be part of the colonies there. And the copy of the report that they took ended up at the University of Michigan in their early English archive. And for a long time, I couldn't find a copy of it in England. There are a couple of copies, and there are a couple of other places that have now shared that report online. And I really, really suggest you read it, because it was a bunch of MPs who wrote it, and they weren't looking to be martyrs for any kind of conspiracy theory. They were trying to record what really happened. And when you see what they recorded, there were dozens of arsonists, and some of those arsonists, well, all of those arsonists were rescued by friends of the king. It certainly puts a very different spin on the fire of London to the one we're told in primary school. Just to summarise, James the Stewart was the most divisive man in 17th century Britain. He had started a war with the Dutch that was totally unprovoked and stole nutmeg just before an unparalleled plague hit London, followed by a fire in which he was clearly involved. His friends included Captain James Grant, who turned off the water, Christopher Wren, who rebuilt London, and Robert Hooke, the world's greatest flea expert. The fire was undoubtedly arson. The plague was very, very strange and inexplicable in modern epidemiological terms. And the war, let's just say, was totally against Whig interests. It totally made England, it made any kind of agreement or commonality between the English and the Dutch very, very difficult. James II's naval wars really made it difficult for the two major Protestant powers in Europe to cooperate. So I hope it's pretty clear why in 1688 the Whigs and the City of London removed James from power in the Glorious Revolution. And I mean, his life after that was a complete farce. I mean, the following year he did invade Ireland and then tried to invade Scotland. Everywhere he went, he caused chaos and misery. I mean, in Ireland, he gained the sobriquet, the nickname Seamus the Shacker, which is James the Shit, because everywhere he went, he managed to piss people off and get people killed because he believed he had a divine right to tell everyone what to do. He really couldn't believe it. He actually, towards the end of his life, he thought it might have been that he'd shagged the wrong woman or done something like that, and that was why God had punished him. He was so in love with his own status, he couldn't accept that it was actually something he might have done, or that there was anything other than God's will involved. He considered himself part of God's plan on earth. So, yeah, work that out. It's probably why his life was so messed up, and he messed up so many other people's lives. So just to finish off, so the Year of Miracles rewrite really sort of focuses around the 1820s, I'm going to say. So the Tories and Whigs were seeing this strategic threat from the Liberals and the idea that the vote might be increased. So they started to, let's say, have peace negotiation talks between the two of them. In the 1820s was when Gilbert Bernay's history was edited, and all that stuff from the Bishop of Salisbury about people setting fire to London was edited out of his history. The parliamentary report that I showed you disappeared very, very thoroughly from English records around the same time. And what's not well known, but and surprised me, was actually Samuel Pepys' diary was actually published for the first time in 1825. Pepys, as I've mentioned, was a very, very, very committed Tory. He made his fortune working for James II. His diary was written in naval code in a thing called tachygraphy, and it actually took people a while to be able to translate it. In the parliamentary report, Pepys is listed as a member of the committee that looked into the fire, but there's no mention of that in any part of his diary. My suspicion is that the bit of the diary that relates to the parliamentary committee and all the chaos that was happening in and around the 18th of September in the aftermath of the fire was just omitted from the diary. They didn't they may have translated it, but they didn't put it into the published version of the diary. It's actually true to say that the editors of the diary said that, look, we've held back some content of the diary, and we're not going to tell you what it is or why we've held it back. You just have to trust us. And even after the diary was very popular, they reprinted it. There was a clamour for the complete diary to be printed. That's never happened. I would love to go and have a look. I think it's in Cambridge, to have a look at the original diary, especially for around the 18th of September 1666, with someone who could read tachygraphy and see what they actually said, what he actually said. Because I bet it isn't what is, I bet I'd be really surprised if there wasn't some very interesting details in there. Just to finish off, I couldn't believe this, but the first book, the first history of the Great Fire of London was actually published in 1923 by Walter George Bell, who was about as Tory as you can get. He also wrote the official version, the official history, I should say, of the Great Plague, of 1665, and that was published a couple of years before. This guy, Walter George Bell, 250 years later anyway, he got to write the official history of these events that we now get taught in school. This is where this book, The Great Fire of London, is where all the information your teachers use, our teachers use to teach our kids, that's where it comes from. And history was undoubtedly rewritten. I can show anyone who's interested, I'll show you different pages of Gilbert Bernay's history and all the stuff that's taken out. It was done to hide the fact the Great Fire of London was perpetrated deliberately by an ultra loyal bunch of Tories who wanted revenge, I would suggest, for the death of Charles I and the humiliation they suffered. If you're not skeptical about what I've just said, I've got a bridge I can sell you as well, because I hope people are engaged in their critical faculties with this, because I couldn't as I was reading through this or coming across this, there's time after time after time, I was like, what? I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe nutmeg would stop you getting plague. I couldn't believe someone had turned off the water, and all of this is there in the records if you go and find it. I believe in my